Welcome back. This is Chicken Philosophy. Martin Luther, part 15, in which we will continue reading the writings and speeches of Martin Luther. If this is your first time watching this program and you would like the playlist, if you would like to start at the beginning of the book, or navigate the playlist and start somewhere in the middle, feel free to click right there. And yeah, so it's a choice going for something a little noir, or since Martin Luther is German, I suppose that'd be Nacht. I assume. I don't know German. Hey, Editor Edward, are we really going to do this black and white thing the whole time? Okay, that's creepy. I don't know who that is. Speaking of creepy, I saw the title of this next part, and it says, Preface to St. Paul's Letter to the Romans, parentheses 1522, 1546. So I assume that this is Martin Luther writing a preface to St. Paul's letter to the Romans, because of course St. Paul's letter to the Romans would have been in what? The 40s? Maybe the 50s? And there's no 19 in front of that. There's not even a 15. There's nothing. It's just the 40s or the 50s. 0040. The year 40 or 50. I don't know when exactly the letter from St. Paul to the Romans would have been written. Maybe it was the 60s. The point is, why do I say it's creepy? Because of chapter 13. There's two things that I know about Romans. And by Romans, obviously, in this context, I mean the book of Romans in the Bible, which is to say the letter from St. Paul to the Romans, meaning the church, the early church in Rome. Those two things are Romans 12 and Romans 13. Romans 12, I love to take out of context. Out of context, it's the best. In context, it's interesting. It's the one where, it says, we are all part of the body of Christ. And bodies have more than one part. There's eyes, there's hearts, there's fingers. They all do different things. Not everybody can be an eye. Not everybody can be a heart. The body wouldn't function if it was all hearts and no eyes or fingers, right? It's an interesting metaphor, especially if you take them at their word and consider that what they're referring to, Christ, is the Word made flesh. Because that, to me, would mean the entirety of the cosmos. Now, a dogmatist, traditionalist would be like, oh, he's getting into that cosmic Christ New Age nonsense. And this program is not for them. Yeah, I go there sometimes. Sometimes I go other places entirely. But anyway, yeah, if you consider that we are all part of the body of God, body meaning physical, meaning guf, for you Hebrew-speaking folk, we're all part of the physical manifestation, the universe. And, you could relate it to bodies of, if you're part of a corporate structure, you could say, we're all part of the body of Starbucks, or whatever, we're all part of the body of whatever cricket team fandom. What's my point? And so it's kind of like, if you are the left pinky, this we call that a pinky. I don't know if that's an American thing or what. Anyway, then don't be jealous of the heart. The body needs the left pinky as much as it needs the heart. Now, you might say that's not true. You can live perfectly well without a left pinky, but not without a heart. And you're right. Yeah, you're right. I guess if you're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, the heart would be the Pope, or maybe the brain. I don't know which. And the left pinky would be like one of the bishops or something, one of the priests or lay people. I don't know. But anyway, Romans 13 is the one where he says, the authorities would not be there if God hadn't put them there. God, not even a blade of grass moves without God's expressed permission. So your mayor that, is raping your wife or whatever, is there because God wants him to be there. So obey your mayor or governor or president or dictator or the cops. That's Romans 13. It's the part of Christianity, the only part of Christianity that a person who's an authoritarian can point to for scriptural support for being a fascist asshole. So that's why I say it's creepy. Anyway, that's enough of an introduction, I'd say. Let's get to the reading. Preface to St. Paul's letter to the Romans, parentheses 1522, semicolon, 1546, end parentheses, February 18, 1546. Luther dies before this preface. Now we know when he died, sometime before February 18th, 1546. In its final form appears, now connected with his last revised translation of the Bible into German. It is a sort of personal testimony to his view of Scripture's vital, persistent, and dynamic core, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Heard of him? With a relatively few edits from the preface, he published with the, quote, September Testament, end quote. They're saying these things as if I have any idea what they're talking about, as if this book isn't the very, very, very first thing I've ever read on the subject of Martin Luther. That's fair, I suppose. Of 1522, the reformer adds his expertise as a theologian to his talent as a translator, preparing his readers to engage a text that he had so brilliantly and carefully brought into German. The reformer's insight into the mercy of God, is that Martin Luther, the reformer? Cool. All right. It's nice to have a title like that. And when we're reading Meccan Revelations, sometimes it says the messenger or the prophet. And I'm like, are they the same person? How many titles does a person need? But he's, the reformer. Cool. All right. I'll be the chicken philosopher. How about that? No, I don't know. All right. Where were we? Into the mercy of God had come to him. He believed as a gift. And by the way, this whole thing is like the Penguin people. They're just letting you know what you're about to read. We haven't gotten to the Martin Luther yet, just the introduction. Okay. And it had come to him, he believed, as a gift. And it was a gift given amid his struggles to understand St. Paul's letter to the Christians at Rome. Normally you'd say in Rome, right? Those struggles, he freely admitted, were, parentheses, at least in part, and parentheses, prompted by the same passage in Romans that eventually would, parentheses, at least in part, end parentheses, bring him peace. Dona nobis pacem. I don't know. Sorry, wrong Martin Luther as far as the tune. Romans 1:17, quote, the just shall live by faith, end quote. Those words had, for a quarter of a century, summarized Luther's understanding of the Bible as the Word of God. The church as the community called into being by that Word, and the Christian life as, quote, faith active in love, end quote. This biblical phrase, among others, brought Luther to know in his marrow the meaning of sin and righteousness, unbelief and faith, law and gospel. St. Paul had helped him understand the God of grace and mercy revealed in Jesus Christ. Surprise, I'm not an asshole. I mean, contrary to... Never mind. You're familiar with the Old Testament, right? Do I have to explain the joke? All right, anyway. And in this practice, Luther wants his readers to understand God that way too. Okay, now we're going to read Martin Luther, the preface to St. Paul's letter to the Romans. This letter is the chief part of the New Testament and is truly the purest gospel. St. Paul's letter to the church in Rome is more pure than the Gospel of John. It's an opinion. It is so valuable that every Christian should know it by heart, memorize each word, and use it every day as if it were their soul's daily bread. We cannot read through it too often or meditate on it too much. The more we engage with it, the more precious it becomes, and the sweeter it tastes. I will do what I can, therefore, so far as God has given me power, to open a way into Romans through this preface, so that it may be better understood by everyone. Formerly, commentaries and all kinds of idle talk had obscured it from view, though in itself it is a bright light, almost sufficient to illuminate the entire Holy Scriptures. To begin with, we must have knowledge of its language and know what St. Paul means by the words law, sin, grace, faith, righteousness, flesh, spirit, and the like. Otherwise, no reading of the book has any value. The little word law you must not here take into human fashion as a teaching about what works are to be done or not done. That is the way with human laws. A law is fulfilled by works, even though one's heart is not in it. God, however, judges the depths of the heart. For this reason, the law of God also rules our innermost heart, and our works cannot satisfy it. The law punishes as hypocrisy and lies the works not done from the bottom of the heart. Consequently, all people are called liars, in bracket parentheses Psalm 111:11. Psalm 116:11. In bracket parentheses, because no one keeps or can keep God's law from the bottom of the heart. Because everyone, from a place deep within, finds no pleasure in what is good, but enjoys what is bad. Period. Full stop. All right, I see it. If now there is no willing pleasure in the good, then the inmost heart is not set on the law of God. And such sin deserves God's wrath. Even though externally one does many good deeds and leads an honorable life. I need a break. Those who've been following along will be aware that I only just recently came around to having the ability to read Martin Luther. I, meaning Gwydion, Edward and BT and Pymander, have been reading Martin Luther. I had to go through a whole journey toward enlightenment in order to arrive at a place where I can read Martin Luther. So forgive me if I just need to pause for a moment and take a sip of coffee. Must be sinful. It's because I enjoy it. It's coffee. If it feels good, God's wrath. If you really don't want to do it, it's what you're supposed to do. That's what we call Protestant work ethic. And gaslighting under capitalism, or whatever, proto-therapy. Where were we? Yes. St. Paul concludes, therefore, in chapter 2:13, that the Jews are all sinners. Now, just to be clear for the algorithm and for whoever's listening, I'm not saying this. Martin Luther is saying that St. Paul is saying this. Martin Luther lived in a time when it was not frowned upon to just openly talk shit about the Jews. Anyway, yeah, sorry about all this. I don't know why am I reading this? Okay, sorry. Saying that all these are my ancestors. That's why. I'm sorry on behalf of my ancestors. Saying that only the doers of the law are righteous before God. He means by this that no one, in terms of his works, is a doer of the law. Rather, he speaks to them thus, quote, "You teach one must not commit adultery, but you yourself commit adultery," end quote. In your heart, every time you look at a woman with lust in your eyes, is the rest of that quote. He's quoting Jesus. 2:22, without saying what? Romans maybe. And again, quote, "In passing judgment upon another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, are doing the very same things," end quote. 2:1. So Paul is quoting Jesus. So Martin Luther is quoting Paul, who's directly quoting Jesus. So it's like if I said, as Larry, the biker who lived across the street from my dad after the divorce, once said, 407 years ago, he's quoting Abraham Lincoln. That's not Larry. That's Abraham Lincoln. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? Weird example. You should read Multiverse Cartographer if you haven't already. That's a playlist about it, but it's a book. Never mind. Then you'll know who Larry the Biker is. Not multiverse cartographer, but smaller mouse, technically. Okie dokie. Where were we? I don't know. This is as if to say, quote, you live a fine outward life in the works of the law. Now, Martin Luther, the Lord was talking about the Pharisees when he criticized them for being outwardly marble and inwardly dead men's bones. There is an important distinction to be made between the Pharisees and the Jews. It's similar to the important distinction that needs to be drawn today between Prime Minister Netanyahu's administration and the Jews. Fucking Martin Luther. Sorry. We're back. You know how to teach everyone, right? And you pass judgment on those who do not so live. You know how to teach everyone. You see the speck that is in the eye of another, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye. And quote from the Gospel of Matthew 7:3. The character in that story called Jesus said that. Maybe the actual guy, assuming he existed, said something similar to that. But at least we know for certain it's in the Gospel of Matthew, which probably had nothing to do with Matthew. But yeah, it's the tradition. Because even though you keep the law outwardly, still going on about this, with works, fearing punishment, or loving reward, you are still doing all these things under duress. And what are you doing that's different from that? You haven't clarified. Such obedience without pleasure in and love for the law is forced and coerced. You think? Yeah, it is. And you're different in what way? Because if the law were not there, and if it were up to you, you would much rather act differently. This is a logical fallacy that is still around today. When the Christian says, oh, well, if you didn't have Christianity, well, you'd just go around raping and murdering and stealing. And then they follow that up with, because if you didn't fear hell and want heaven, then you would just go around raping and stealing and murdering. Like as if being an ethical person were dependent upon specifically. So Martin Luther's saying this about, quote unquote, the Jews. Protestant Christians today say the same thing about themselves, except they say it like it's a good thing. And they claim that without those laws, you would just run around doing horrible things. Check the stats for how many people in the overly Christian states are on Pornhub right now, watching debaucherous things that are condemned in Leviticus, versus the more progressive-minded, agnostic, atheist, secular humanist states. It's interesting. The effect that restriction has. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it forces people to secretly behave the way that you told them that they would want to behave, were it not for the punishment that they'll get if the fucking... It's stupid. Maybe Martin Luther isn't the source of the stupidity. He's just the parrot of the stupidity that still exists today. Calm down, Gwydion. Calm down. The sermons on Lent were cooler. Now he's back to this shit. All right, let's keep going. What are the Jews doing wrong today, Martin? It follows from this that in your heart of hearts you hate the law. What would be the point then in your teaching others not to steal if you yourself are a thief at heart and would gladly be one outwardly if you dared? The law, if he were standing in front of me right now, like if he were giving this speech to a crowd, it would be the secular law that would stop me from walking up and just breaking off his jaw with my fist. Nothing else. I wouldn't want to get arrested for that. I'm sorry. Anyway, where were we? Though, to be sure, the outward work does not lag far behind among such hypocrites. Have you met one? Have you ever met a Jew? Or have you only fantasized about them while whacking off to the letters of St. Paul? Be honest, Martin. Anyway. So you teach others, but not yourself, nor do you yourself know what you are teaching. You have never yet understood the law correctly. Moreover, the law increases sin, as St. Paul says in chapter 5, verse 20. Because the more the law demands what we cannot do, the more we hate the law. This is why Paul says in chapter 7, verse 14, that the law is spiritual. I just keep coming back to questioning whether it's even worth it to read Martin Luther. Okay. I acknowledge this irritates me more because it reminds me of my grandparents, my cousins, and generally the people in the community that I grew up in. So that's why it's having more of an irritating effect than reading Catholicism, which was something I learned existed as a young teenager, I think. And then in my 20s, intentionally got into because just to freak out the ghosts of my ancestors that were still haunting the house I was living in at the time. And my grandma she's like, oh, but they're very superstitious and they think that, I'm like, well, from my point of view, never mind. Anyway, that wasn't the only reason. The reasons weren't necessarily good, and Islam coming completely from the standpoint of, generally, as a base, coming from the standpoint of wanting to help to alleviate from, and I admit, from what may be coincidentally termed, or pointed out to be a Christian impulse to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself and your family, and to do one's part to help to encourage others to do the same. In other words, preach the gospel far and wide, right? To acknowledge the neural bias, the mammalian bias that people have when something is recognized as other. And how that gets encouraged by fascism and by, propaganda and by just carelessness, by just people wanting to sell shit. Let's sell something. How do we do it? Get everybody hating the same thing and then sell that to them. They'll watch, 24 Kiefer Sutherland and then buy the shit in the ads in between, right? So, yeah, wanting to delve in and learn more about Islam. And then the parts that are like, oh, this is this is kind of stupid, actually. Like, they don't cause me to, like, have an outburst. They don't cause me to be like, fuck you, Martin Luther. I'm never like, fuck you, Ibn Arabi. It just never happens in reading Ibn Arabi. But yeah, the some of the narrowness, partly because of the time, and just I don't know. Is it worth it? Why am I doing this? Can anything good come out of it other than just increasing frustration? I already know that Protestants think this way. Not all Protestants, but the ones that don't think this way have moved beyond the origins of Protestantism, just mostly like in the past few decades, or even the past few years. If there's a congregation, an Episcopal congregation somewhere that doesn't think this way, I don't know what good can come from it, but I'll keep going. I'll follow through on the plan, at least to read this book. We're already more than 1/3 of the way through this book, so I don't know. I might have to veto someone who said, he wrote other things. We'll have to get more Martin Luther when we finish this book. No. Let's stick to the plan of shifting to the Nag Hammadi. It's also dumb, but at least it's not infuriating. Might be for some folks watching, but not for me at all. It's somewhere between and all the argons again, and funny and interesting. Like it kind of hovers in that zone, and that's a good zone, emotionally speaking. This shit is just infuriating at times. I wish he'd change this subject. All right. It will be loved and fulfilled with this kind of a spiritual heart. It requires this kind of spirit. If that spirit is not in the heart, then sin, unhappiness with the law, and anger toward the law remains, even though the law itself is good and just and holy. I'm going to stop reading there, and, I'm curious to see how he's going to differentiate this way that the Jews are in his mind with how he thinks that for lack of a better term, Lutherans ought to be. Because, he's really only describing how Protestants are. There's really very little difference. So, we'll leave it up to whoever's next. Edward, BT. I think probably Edward's up next in the Martin Luther recitals. And, all right. Next time it's going to be Frater BT reading Secret of the Golden Flower. So that'll be a very different mood overall than this episode was. Feel free to like and subscribe. What are you doing here? Did you enjoy this? On what level did you enjoy it? Did you get something out of it? Maybe you relate with what I'm going through, but you're wise enough and have enough common sense not to actually sit down and read Martin Luther. Who would do that? I guess that's why I'm doing it. It's kind of what my dad used to call a tantric flow reversal, like having gay sex when you're straight, to just blow through all of these fixed, I don't know. I don't have the words. And I don't even know if it makes sense. It's a left-hand path thing. So in the same spirit in which the Agori eat human flesh and feces, in that exact same spirit and for that exact same reason, we'll continue to read Martin Luther. Till next time.